Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Secular Soapbox on Promethean Secular Frontier. This is a show where we have strong opinions on various topics, and we always love to share them, but from a secular perspective. I'm your host, Bryce, and I'm here with my co-host, Caleb, as always. Caleb, come on in.
What's going on today? How we doing today, Bryce? I asked first this time.
I'm doing today's a little bit of a high stress day for me, but overall good. Not as good as some, but better than most. That's kind of like the way that I like to describe days like this. So.
I'll take that.
Yeah.
I take that. Overall net positive.
Sure. It's relative, it's relative to what's going on in the rest of the world with other people. But we have another philosophical argument today to tackle. Seems like we've been doing a lot of these. This will be like the third in the row, I think.
Yes, you know what? They don't get boring or anything. I love these.
That's true. Hopefully everyone else does too. Today we're talking ontological arguments. Specifically St. Anselm's ontological argument for the existence of God. So, do you know the ontological argument?
I think that it's been a while. But I think this is the one that's like, if God can exist, he must exist if he's the best possible being, or something like that.
Possible being. Okay. That's about what I know. So, but I'm sure that there's a little bit more to that, and we're gonna have a professional come on and break it down for us. So, to help us break down this philosophical argument and to see if they withstand the test of scrutiny, we're going to have David A. Dombrowski, philosopher and professor of philosophy at Seattle University. And he was also formerly the president of the Metaphysical Society of America. Dan, welcome aboard. Did I pronounce your name correctly? Dombrowski?
That's close enough. So okay. Polish is very hard, so you got real close. That's good.
Appreciate that. And also to kind of help us out with the discussion, we're bringing back a returning friend of ours, Ceasetoknow, host of Axioms on Trial. Patreon link in the description. So, Cease, what's going on?
Thank you so much for having me again. It's good to see you guys.
Yeah. So, now, this is Professor Dombrowski's first appearance on Secular Soapbox and on any of our PSF shows. So, Dan, do me a favor. I know I just gave like a very basic sort of introduction, but why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself for our audience who may be hearing of you for the first time.
I'm going to interrupt you real quick, Bryce, because your audio is coming in awful. It's really, you might need to reset or like jump out and come back or something. Well, I'm sorry, try again?
Yeah, let me do that.
All right. In the meantime, Dan, if you go ahead and introduce yourself, man, that'd be great. Appreciate it, brother.
Okay, yeah, well, as has been stated, I teach philosophy at Seattle University, and several years ago I published a book titled Rethinking the Ontological Argument. So I know I think the goal of the program here is to debunk the ontological argument, and there are people who do want to debunk it. There's a well-known philosopher named Graham Oppy, who's a religious skeptic, who says that the ontological argument is completely worthless. So I think it's a valuable argument for a couple different reasons. First, it helps clarify the concept of God. And then also it provides some reasons for believing in the existence of God. And those are two quite different projects. So presumably anybody who's either a religious believer or a religious skeptic has some concept of God in mind, right? So if you want to claim that there is no God, you have some concept of God in mind, such that you want to reject such a being. So the ontological argument, at the very least, is helpful in trying to clarify what the concept of God refers to. So in terms of the history of the argument, the first person who's given credit for defending the ontological argument is somebody named St. Anselm in the 11th century, who was Archbishop of Canterbury. Came over with the Norman invasion, to Great Britain. And but there was anticipation of this argument back in Plato's time. So Plato arguably could be said to have a version of the ontological argument. So the argument's been around for about 2,500 years or so. And then some of the most famous people in the history of philosophy have defended the argument. Now this is going to sound hyperbolic, but it might be the case that the ontological argument is the most discussed argument in the history of philosophy. There's been more inks, spilled in defense of the argument and then also trashing the argument than just about any other argument in the history of philosophy. So some of the people who have defended it have included Descartes, the famous scientist and mathematician, Leibniz, who was, one of the discoverers of calculus, Spinoza, the great Jewish philosopher, Hegel, and so on. And there have been a lot of people who have trashed the argument, including people in Anselm's own lifetime. There was a monk named Ganilo who disagreed with it. St. Thomas Aquinas disagreed with the ontological argument. But the two major figures who presumably, struck the death knell to the argument were David Hume and Immanuel Kant in the 18th century. They both criticized the argument.
So
However,
before you go on, Dan, can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Coming in great now.
So I'm loud and clear now. Okay. So you gave us a breakdown, you mentioned the origins of the argument. I do want to dig deeper into that, but I want to get a little bit of your background as well. I'm guessing you're coming at this from an atheist perspective?
No. No.
Okay.
So I think that the argument... I think the argument is most fruitful in helping to clarify the concept of God. Now, that'd be like a minimalist aim of the argument.
Well, no, the question I'm asking you is, how do you label yourself, or do you?
I would say I'm a neoclassical theist. So
neoclassical theist, okay.
Yeah, or a process theist.
And
so I would defend the claim that there is a God, but what I mean by God is not what traditional religious believers have claimed God to be.
Okay.
So I'm likely to get criticism both from religious skeptics on the one hand and then religious traditionalists on the other.
Now, is the ontological argument one that you think supports your conception of what God is, or one that is not useful for an argument for the God that you believe in?
Supports it.
Okay.
Although Anselm had a traditionalist conception of God, that I would disagree with. So unwittingly, I think he makes a great discovery. Okay. So you find this a lot in the history of science, where, say, Lavoisier discovers oxygen, but he thinks he discovered dephlogisticated air. So Anselm makes a great discovery as well, although he might not have been exactly clear about what it was.
Wait, what was that again? Dephlogisticated air? What was that?
Yeah, dephlogisticated air. That's what Lavoisier thought he discovered, even though in the history of science books, he's, seen as the discoverer of something else other than what he thought he had discovered. So
that's too many syllables for me.
Okay,
so yeah. Like a 6-syllable word.
Yeah.
Okay, so Saint Anselm, who I guess kind of pioneered this argument, and it's other people have run with it. I think you mentioned Descartes. Also.
Descartes, Leibniz.
Okay.
Kurt Gödel, the great mathematician, 20th century mathematician, had a version of the argument as well. I think one of the key moments in the 20th century for the argument came when a philosopher named Charles Hartshorne sort of rediscovered the argument and saw that there's two versions of the argument in St. Anselm, and that all the critics had been criticizing one version but not the other. So the argument got a shot in the arm in the mid-decades of the 20th century with the discovery of a version of the argument based on modal logic. And then there are people like Oppie, as I've mentioned, who, have criticized that version as well. So it's a highly contested argument.
Sure. So
yeah.
I guess maybe the best thing to do would be let's go through the premises. I'm sure there's this can be done in syllogistic form. There's a syllogism of the argument, right?
Yeah. Ceasetoknow says that he thinks he has it. What you got there, brother?
Tell me if I got this wrong, but this is what I have up here. It's possible that a maximally great being exists. If it's possible that a maximally great being exists, then it exists in some possible world. And if a maximally great being exists in some possible world, then it exists in every possible world. If a maximally great being exists in every possible world, then it exists in the actual world. Therefore, a maximally great being exists in the actual world. Therefore, God exists. That is one version, but let me know if
is that about what you how you would put it, Dan?
Yeah, that's one version. I think that makes sense as far as it goes. I come at it slightly differently. How about this, just to get us started into the argument, quite far from its history and all. As I see it, that there are three alternatives regarding the existence of God, and these are the three alternatives sort of made possible by modal logic. So the existence of God is either, now these are the three alternatives: first, impossible, like a square circle, right? Just as a contradiction in terms. Or second, the existence of God is contingent. So God may exist or God may not exist, depending on circumstances. Or third, God's existence is necessary. God must exist. And I think that those are logically exhaustive alternatives. Either God is impossible or contingent or necessary.
I have a question about that.
Yeah.
You said you included impossibility as an option, and then you went to contingent. Why not just label it as possible?
Yeah, you could say that. That'd be acceptable to me to use that language. Yeah. So God might possibly exist or possibly not exist. That's what I mean by saying that God's existence would be contingent. Yeah.
Okay. And I guess maybe the reason why I'm confused is because when I hear people use the word contingent, it implies that the existence of that thing depends on the existence of something else.
Right. That's right.
However, it is possible for things we can talk about things that possibly exist that are not contingent, couldn't we?
Ooh, I don't know about that, but we can think of things that possibly would exist that do not exist. Right? I mean,
sure.
So some things, their existence is possible, but in point fact, they do not exist. So
I think that's the key point. The key problem there, this argument, is exactly that. That I think the ontological argument conflates a possibility with something that could be hypothetically true. Like there's nothing illogical, depending on what kind of version of God you're describing, about the notion that a God could exist, as long as its properties aren't in contradiction, which some versions of God are. But there's nothing about that possibility that actually moves that into an actuality. And this is what I think the argument fails to do. It doesn't ground it into what's possible. It tries to, but it kind of does a I'm trying to think of the word. The God in the first premise and the God in the second is now a different God that they were describing. It's like a trick, I think.
Yeah, that's one of the standard criticisms of the argument that's been around for centuries. Yeah, that it's moving from the idea of God to the actuality of God. Okay. I think one key part of the argument is, can I go back to those three alternatives? God's existence is either impossible or possible, contingent, number two, and then number three, necessary. Anselm's great discovery, if it is such, okay, is that the second alternative drops out in the case of God. So if the term God refers to the greatest conceivable being, okay, and I take it that even religious skeptics might find that definition of God acceptable, right? That the term God refers to, well, typically religious skeptics think of God as the greatest conceivable being and then want to deny that such a being exists, okay? What Anselm wants to claim is that the second alternative drops out, that the greatest conceivable being could not exist contingently, because if the greatest conceivable being existed contingently, it would not be the greatest conceivable being.
Right, that follows logically. I'm wondering, is that
why? Hold on. What does that mean that it follows logically to say that? I mean, let's say that the being came into being because of something else. Right? That something else obviously isn't a being because it's not the greatest possible being, but Where's the logic of saying that something created the greatest possible being?
What Anselm's claim is, now this is as interpreted by Charles Hartshorne, is that the logic of perfection is inconsistent with contingent existence. And if contingent existence drops out as an alternative, then a preliminary conclusion of the argument is that either God is impossible or necessary.
Can I jump in for a second? Just because I think that's a really important point. Is that I think my problem is fundamentally that the notion of perfection,
I was just going there.
as far as I understand it, has no content. I think it's completely arbitrary that we would define perfection in that way. I don't think a greatest anything exists. I think we can compare certain things, right? We can say we have certain preferences, but that's a projection of our own particular values, not a projection, not a discovery of anything that is actually real out there in any way. So
let me ask this question, Cease, before you go on. Let me ask Dan this question, because I think it would be helpful if we came up with a working definition of God. I know we've talked about how other people have applied the argument, but since you're a theist, Dan, can you give us a definition of God that we could apply this argument to?
Well, the definition that Anselm works on is the idea that God is that than which no greater can be conceived.
Okay, so the greatest conceivable being, you would agree with that as that would kind of be your... That's right.
And then there may be some alternative definitions that have a family resemblance to that, like a perfect being.
Okay, is there a difference?
Then there are questions about whether or not that being exists, right? So in other words, I would think that you could entertain the concept of God without committing to the claim that that being exists. It's just that you're thinking about what the greatest conceivable being would be.
No, I get that, but I want to know, is the greatest conceivable being equal to perfection, or is that two different things? Because are you saying that the greatest conceivable being is perfect?
Yeah, that's what to be talking about God would be to be talking about a perfect being, a being concerning which you could not imagine a greater.
Well, I can. So I guess maybe I'll try to explain why I'm asking. I can imagine the greatest of all dogs, but it would still be imperfect, right? So the greatest of all beings may not necessarily be perfect. It could still have imperfections in some way and still be the greatest of all beings that exist.
I would actually push back on that. I don't think that it makes much sense to claim that we can imagine the greatest possible dog, because there's no definition that actually makes something greatest. This is like, I think it's a word without content. It's something that we kind of use because we're used to using it. But when we examine it closer, I don't think there's anything there. What you might think is a better dog than another, or a perfect dog, might not be what I think is a perfect dog, right? On what grounds do we establish some kind of universal definition that would make those terms make sense?
I ultimately, and I agree with you. I don't agree. I don't know what a perfect dog would be, right? I know what the greatest dog I've ever had is, right? But I'm comparing him to other dogs.
So that's a good point. This we all know in principle, at least, what the perfect circle is, right? So when we say that God is perfect, is there anything remotely close to similar to the way that a circle could possibly be perfect to how God could possibly be perfect?
I'm not sure. What
so
you
I
mean
just because this word perfection, as Ceasetoknow was saying, it's rather arbitrary, right? It seems to be this rather nebulous term that we seem to be able to apply to insert here, whatever it is that take. The greatest possible being is that which no greater being could be conceived. The greatest possible being must therefore save as many souls, the most souls possible, right? Well, I can imagine a God that has one more soul.
It sounds like you're looking for property, because perfection and goodness, these are all descriptive terms, right? But you need like good for what? Perfect
well,
in what way?
if you say perfect in this manner,
Right.
you could always say that there's an improvement to be made, unless you were to say that it's perfect, like a circle might be perfect.
So how about that, Dan? When we talk about perfection, can we get a little bit more specific than that? Can we say in what manner it's perfect?
I wonder if I could go back to the idea of the perfect dog.
Yep.
That objection to Anselm was first offered by a contemporary of Anselm in the 11th century, a monk named Ganilo. It was called the perfect island argument. So Ganilo tried to trivialize Anselm's argument by saying that if this argument went through to prove the existence of God, you could also prove the existence of a perfect island. Okay, because if the island did not exist, it would not be perfect. So if you're conceiving of a perfect island, you would have to be thinking of an island that existed. You could do the same thing with the dog, I assume, right? If you were thinking of a perfect dog that did not exist, it would not be a perfect dog. The problem with that sort of objection, and I think you've already touched on this, is that an island is the sort of thing that is limited by definition. It's a body of land completely surrounded by water, and a dog by definition is a being that has a finite lifespan. So that the word perfection, and so a couple of the commenters have, suggested that there's something arbitrary or wishy-washy or nebulous about the word perfection, but it seems that the word perfection, whatever it refers to, would not be referring to a finite thing like an island or a dog. It would be referring to that which would have all great-making properties, whatever they may be. And presumably one of them would be what? Necessary existence.
Can you conceive of a perfect circle?
Well, a circle by definition is what? A geometrical figure, all of whose points are equidistant from a common center. I don't know what the word perfection adds to that. I mean, the nice thing about mathematical definitions is that they're really precise. It's like if an entity is a circle, all of its points are equidistant from the common center. There's no better or worse.
I mean, let's be honest. I'm sorry, that may come rough. I have to be honest, rather, to say that you don't really know what that means, because, honestly, we all know that this isn't a perfect... Well, you can't see it, but the circle I just drew, we all know isn't a perfect circle, but we all know what I mean by perfect circle.
Right, yeah.
Maybe it would help if...
What you just drew on the shade of paper is really not a circle. It's a drawing of a circle, right?
That's...
Maybe it'll help,
ones.
Dan, if I ask you, Can you name any perfect thing? Can you describe something that is perfect?
Well, the word or the name God refers to that being which, if it existed, would be a perfect being.
Right. I guess I'm looking for something outside of that, because that's the thing that we're trying to prove. So outside of the thing that you're applying it to, can you apply the term to any other existing thing?
I mean, it seems to me that approach is kind of circular, right? Like, it's not actually giving a definition. It's just pointing to something that we haven't actually understood or experienced. You said that one thing that you just said that was interesting was that the argument doesn't work when it comes to like an island or a dog, because those kind of things are limited in some way, therefore not perfect. But I'm sure you know this. The same thing has been said to apply to these notions of God with these kind of omni-properties. Like, if God knows everything that will happen, then he is limited in the sense that he can't change his mind. That, for somebody, could be a limitation, which is, again, going back to what I was saying earlier, even what we think of as limitations seem to be completely arbitrary to me. The idea that something existing forever, as opposed to having a finite existence, that it's a living forever, that's not the limitation, or that is the preferable thing. How is that not also arbitrary, and therefore just more of a projection, more about what we wish was the case?
Yeah, I understand that sort of objection to theism in general, that the sort of Feuerbach objection that all these concepts are just like human projections, and we're sort of legislating God into existence by the way we use terms, right? But what I was trying to get at earlier was that if there are three logical possibilities regarding the existence of God, impossible, contingent, or necessary, something significant occurs when Anselm argues that that second option drops out with respect to the concept of God, okay? That God could not be contingent. Now, if that is the case, then God is either impossible or necessary. Now, notice that does not establish the existence of God. That still leaves an option open for the religious skeptic, right? But what the religious skeptic would have to argue at that point is that the concept of God is impossible, logically impossible, sort of like a square circle, right? A lot of religious skeptics I've met want to claim what? Well, sure, God is possible, just as Santa Claus is possible, right? But in point of fact, God does not exist. That sort of argumentation, I think, drops out once you sort through Anselm's argument.
Well, it drops out if you accept his definition, his use of words.
That's right.
Which I don't see any reason to do. Like I said, I think his approach is just as arbitrary in the way that he defines it.
Yes, if you're getting it.
And I'm also concerned about this idea that logic is somehow what dictates reality itself. I think logic is a tool that we use, which is itself in some ways flawed, especially when you get to the craziness of things like quantum mechanics, right? Like logic, I think, is more descriptive than it is prescriptive, although I think it functions as both. But I've never been very convinced by arguments that think that it's logic itself that gives rise to what exists or doesn't exist. I think logic is just a tool that we use to try to make sense of the world.
Yeah.
I think I also, the problem for me with the contingent argument is I recognize that the word existence is used in two ways. Sometimes we talk about conceivable or conceptual existence versus something that exists in reality. So conceivable existence versus actual existence, right? And I think it's really easy to conflate those two things when we're having these conversations about possibility and contingent and all of that. So I like contingent for me doesn't really, that's kind of a separate issue. That's, whether something is contingent or necessary is separate. We can apply that to a concept of the mind or, things that actually exist. But there's two different questions. Does this exist conceptually? Does this exist actually? And then there's the second question: does it exist as a contingent thing, and does it exist as a necessary thing? But
how would we ever know? How would we ever have access to ontology on that level to actually know whether or not that thing was existentially necessary? Because we can talk about where it logically follows, right? But much of what we observe in nature, we can say that we can imagine things that aren't a logical contradiction, but we don't observe in nature at all. And so just the possibility, the logical possibility doesn't itself give reason to believe that such a thing could exist in actual reality. And so I don't see any, I'm always skeptical of this whole contingent versus necessary approach, because I'm unconvinced that we can have access to ontology to that degree to know the difference. I guess is the point I'm making.
I don't recognize the existence of any necessary. I don't know what a necessary thing would be. If we're distinguishing between necessary and contingent, I have yet for someone to describe to me an actual necessary thing.
The only thing that seems necessary to me is that non-existence doesn't make any sense. So to me, that is the only thing that's necessary, is that something has to exist.
Right.
But
that's where I was going to go. I mean,
Okay.
An example of a necessary truth regarding existence is the claim that something exists.
Something necessarily exists.
Yeah, that's a metaphysical claim in the sense that it's true in any possible world. Because this goes back to Parmenides, who existed even before Plato. Because if you try to think about the existence of absolute non-existence, you end up contradicting yourself. You can't talk about it without turning absolute nothingness into somethingness.
Well, Descartes solved this. We are thinking agents, right? So as long as I exist, then something exists. It doesn't matter whether you guys exist or not. I definitely exist. So there is a necessary existence there. But beyond that, I don't know what would be necessary, or like C said, I don't know how we would know.
Well, if you were looking for an example of a necessary truth regarding existence, I mean, that is one, that something exists. So if you wanted to defend Anselm's argument, you might suggest that there's a second one, that God exists. Now, you could cut the argument off if you could show that the existence of God was something like a square circle. So somebody, I forget, was one of you guys mentioned that there are concepts of God or versions of the concept of God that are contradictory. So theists are famous or infamous for saying contradictory things, right? So notice you would, if you wanted to defend Anselm's argument, have to really work hard to come up with a concept of God that was not internally contradictory.
What is the basis for asserting a God in the first place as a necessary being? Because we have the basis of our existence with reality for asserting that you are a necessary being, or your existence is necessary.
My existence is not necessary. We can easily imagine a world in which I did not exist. Actually, 70 years ago, there was a world where I did not exist.
Well, let me rephrase it then. We have a basis for imagining that something exists.
Okay.
Because we have existed, because we're experiencing existence, right?
No. The reason why is because we cannot conceive of the absolute non-existence of everything.
No, but the reason you can't conceive of that is because you are here to conceive of things. If you weren't here to conceive of anything, then it's irrelevant, right? But the fact that you are here and able to conceive means that we have a rational justification for accepting the necessity of things existing. I guess my question is, why add the necessity of God on top of that? What is the basis for adding that other necessary?
Well, if the preliminary conclusion in the argument is that God's existence is either impossible or necessary, then in order to have the argument go through, all you'd have to do is show that the existence of God was at least possible.
Okay? So the existence of God may be possible or impossible, right? But we're talking about our conception of God. We're talking about a concept now, right? That doesn't mean that a God existing in reality is possible. Like, I can conceive of the possibility of God, we're speaking of God as a concept, right? And so that could be possible, it could be impossible. But that doesn't translate to a God existing in reality being possible, because those are two different types of existence.
And real quick, just to go off of what you just said, I also want to respond to a comment that was just made. We can imagine a reality where none of us existed, but that says nothing about what is existentially necessary. Like when we make that kind of statement, we assume that things could have been otherwise. But how would we know that to actually be the case, more than just potential? Again, this is where I think that the limitation of language is an issue.
Yeah. It almost seems like we're saying, because we exist, therefore we necessarily had to exist, or because something exists, therefore something necessarily had to exist in reality.
Yeah, I think what I'm saying is that we can't know on an existential level whether it is or it isn't necessary. Like, we can say logically it might not follow, but I think there's another kind of necessary. When we say, like, with the statement that, well, we can imagine a world where none of us existed. Yes, there's no contradiction there. But that's assuming that the past could have been different than what it was. And when we look at, and again, it's quite a side detour here, but when we look at something like time in the way it's understood in physics, there's no potential there. Like the past, the present, and the future just are. That there's no could have been otherwise. It's like the chapters in a book are just there. And so I'm skeptical of this notion of necessary and contingent as being useful in illuminating whether or not these concepts that we have, including the concept of God, makes much sense. I don't know if
I would not want to, in response to that, I understand what you're getting at. I think in response to that, I would not want to do too much work, too much intellectual work with the concept of necessity or necessary existence. Okay, to say that it's necessarily the case that something exists doesn't tell us anything about the details of what does actually exist, right? It just says that the concept of now relative nothingness makes sense. If you said something like a baseball is nothing like a corkscrew, right? So that's a comparative judgment there. But it's the concept of absolute nothingness that is unintelligible. But that doesn't tell us a whole lot about what it does actually exist. Likewise, if you claimed that God existed necessarily, that doesn't tell you a whole lot about how God exists moment to moment, right? It just suggests that a greatest conceivable being is either impossible or necessary. Now, theists are going to try to say a lot else, right? They're going to say that God is omniscient, and somebody used the phrase all the omni attributes, all good and all knowing and so on. That tells you something, perhaps, but it still doesn't tell you concretely what it would be like to know everything that is out there to be known and to care for all beings that could be cared for. So in other words, it's very abstract just to say that something exists and to say that a perfect being exists. It doesn't tell you a whole lot about the world, but it tells you something about it.
So what would you say are your, first of all, you mentioned the omni attributes. Is that something that you also accept about the necessary being?
Well, as a neoclassical theist, I have a lot of criticisms of the way that the concept of God has been, played out in the Abrahamic religions. For example, I'm a critic of the notion of omnipotence. And a lot of theists are not going to want to give up on the concept of God being all-powerful. And the argument I have goes back to Plato. It's the idea that anything that exists has to affect others or be affected by others in however slight a way. So anything that exists has some powers of its own. But if the things that exist have some powers of their own, no being could be all-powerful. Because if some being were all-powerful, if that's what you mean by omnipotence, then that would entail what? The non-existence of everything else in the world.
I think the way that most people who are proponents of the omnipotent God define the type of omnipotence we're talking about as being maximally powerful. So God isn't necessarily all powerful, but he's a maximally powerful being who can do anything that is logically possible. And they've kind of narrowed, what the
Depends
definition
on your
is.
cup of tea, Bryce, honestly.
But that's the
Pardon?
thing, even that term maximally, like what is that actually relating to in real life? These goes back to the same thing as perfection. These are, I think,
Right. That's the problem. I agree with you. Yeah. But I only said that because I'm aware of some of the apologetics for why God can be omnipotent, despite the fact that, there are things that he can't do both logically and because for the reasons that Dan just laid out. So you don't accept omnipotence, or you're skeptical of it, Dan. What about the other omnis?
Well, I'm also skeptical of omniscience if what is meant by omniscience is that God would know the outcome to future contingencies before they occur. So I don't adhere to a deterministic view of the universe. So Ceasetoknow talked about determinism earlier, right? And So I believe that there's a partially indeterminate future in front of us. So what it would mean to be omniscient, or at least I redefine omniscience, but I don't trash it altogether, but I don't have the sort of concept of omniscience that most theists have. I take it that the classical theistic view of omniscience is that God knows what? The outcome to all future contingencies in minute detail and with absolute assurance. That God knows, the moments when all four of us are going to die, and how, and so on and so forth before it occurs. Now, this leads to the nastiest version of the theodicy problem, because if God is also omnipotent, you wonder why God does not do something to prevent preventable evil to people. So I don't see how you could be both omnibenevolent and omnipotent and omniscient in the classical theistic sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what
I think even before you, just to piggyback on that, I think omniscience and omnipotence contradict each other on their own, even without the omnibenevolence. Mm-hmm. Because if God is all-knowing, that means that he can't do everything. He can only do that which he knows. Mm-hmm. And if he's all-powerful, then he could do things that he doesn't know, which means he's not all-knowing.
In what ways do you presume that God is maximal, Dan?
Well, with respect to knowledge, I would think that the greatest knower would know past actualities as already actualized, would know the present in its presentness, subject to limitations in physics, right? But then the greatest knower would not know the outcome to future contingencies as already actualized. That would seem to misunderstand the future. In other words, the greatest knower would know future possibilities and probabilities as possibilities and probabilities. To know a future possibility as already actualized would be to misunderstand things.
But there is a problem with this approach, and I'm no expert in this field whatsoever. Like, you would have to have my brother on the show and talk with him. But my understanding of physics is that nothing about the future is potential in the way that you're describing it. Like, from my understanding, what physics tells us is that the future is as real and already in existence as the present and the past.
Some physicists defend that. Einstein held that to the end, and I just find that completely unbelievable.
So it sounds like we're distinguishing between the A theory of time and the B theory of time and different theories of time, presentism versus...
I would be very curious to see the conversation between, because my brother is a physicist, and I've had him on my show about this before, and I'd be curious to see why you find it unbelievable and what you would say in response to some of the reasons why he holds that view.
Yeah, if you just take one example, I mean, just imagine us, all four of us here. I didn't know that all four of us were going to be here just a half hour before the show started. But the idea that it was in the cards, in minute detail, that the four of us would be here now from the time of the Big Bang, which is basically what you're saying about a deterministic universe, I find just as incredible as the really stupid things that theists have sometimes said about virgin births and so on. That strikes me as just a completely unbelievable hypothesis from the perspective of lived time, okay, that I confront indeterminacy with respect to the future, right? And it seems incredible to me to think that it was all in the cards from the very beginning. Now, I know there are some physicists who are determinists, and I think it's really a legacy of a Newtonian view of the world that, is just...
Quite the opposite. As far as I understand it, it's much of quantum mechanics is a rejection of Newtonian physics, as far as I understand it. And again, I'm not, I shouldn't even really be going into this, but just I kind of had to say something because of what I heard earlier. This is not just a hypothesis. The reasons why I think that is based on actual experiments. Again, I'll talk. Maybe we can all come back at some point.
Let's come back. Let's come back to that because I want to wrap up the. We mentioned two of the. What's the omnibenevolent, right?
Yeah.
So.
It strikes me that if you're thinking about the greatest conceivable being, it's hard for me to give up on the notion of omnibenevolence. In other words, the concept of the greatest conceivable being strikes me as being integrally connected to the concept of omnibenevolence. If a being were not omnibenevolent, I would be really reluctant to view it as the greatest conceivable being.
I find that so far to be the most arbitrary
Arbitrary.
Well, I would
factor
wonder
that you've brought it, like attribute that you brought into the equation. And let's just say, for the sake of argument, that God wasn't omnibenevolent. What does that change, in principle?
It seems to me that you're jettisoning the concept of perfection altogether, right? It would.
So why can't this not perfect thing do what the perfect thing did?
Well, no, but because he's already defined it as perfect, and so if it's not perfect, and what it sounds like you're doing is you're including like.
Well, I'm saying we have this not perfect being. We're not going to call it God. It's the God clone, right? This is God identical, except it's not omnibenevolent. It's that factor is just it's maybe it's 99% the way they are, maybe it's 1% the way. It doesn't matter. It's just not omnibenevolent. What can the clone, or what can the real God do that the clone can't, and why?
From my understanding, he would say be perfect.
Yeah,
right?
Or exist.
Well, then wouldn't that also imply that you don't need to be perfect to create everything?
Well, that may be the problem Dan is having, because you've kind of defined perfection as one of the attributes of God. You said that God was a maximally great being and perfection. That was one of the first questions I asked you. So if you're defining it as perfect, then that would
there's confusion. This God clone is not perfect. So we have a not God clone that can do everything that the God can, except be perfect.
Yeah, that part about could do everything that God could do, like could this clone that you're talking about commiserate with the sufferings of people? Would strike me, if it's not omnibenevolent, it might not care if beings are
I think
suffering.
that's a fair response to what Caleb just asked, but because we brought in this quality of we brought in the idea of morality into being related to perfection. So I'm curious how you reconcile that with the problem of evil.
Well, I think classical theism just does a terrible job with the problem of evil. I've never had any. It doesn't surprise me that there are religious skeptics in the world, given classical theistic theodicy. If you think of really heart-wrenching examples like a kid with a birth defect, having intense pain, to think that there would be an all-powerful being that could prevent that and does not. I find just completely unbelievable.
And you resolve it by saying that God is not all powerful. So.
Exactly, that's the linchpin. In other words, it's in a way it's very Greek. It's very much like Plato's view. The Greeks it never occurred to them that God could be all powerful, because they were intensely aware of the fact that there's tragedy in the world, right? And in a way, you start with that sort of experience of suffering and tragedy in the world.
As a moral realist, I'm actually, I think, on your side with that, in the sense that a God who cared about the suffering of other conscious beings would be a better God than one who didn't. But that, obviously, that position arises from the fact that I am more realist, and I think that morality is actually something that exists and refers to something that's real. And so I actually think that is more grounded in reality than I think some of the other definitions. But then again, like I was saying earlier, somebody who's not a moral realist might think, well, that is just my own biases and intuitions on morality that I'm projecting.
Yeah.
So
actually, in a way, I agree with that. There's of those three attributes: omnipotence, omniscience, and omnibenevolence. Omnibenevolence is the one that intuitively strikes me as most integrally connected to and tightly connected to the logic of perfection.
So I asked about the problem of evil, and you gave an example of suffering. I actually don't think that. I think that's its own problem. The problem of suffering, I like to call it. I think that that's distinct from the problem of evil, though. But it sounds like I know a lot of theists kind of conflate them or mix them together as if suffering equals evil, but I don't. I think that that's its own thing. When I'm looking at when I'm talking about evil, I'm looking at things like I don't want to say. Well, first of all, do you believe in evil? Like, how would you define evil?
Well, if I understand you correctly, I mean, there's a difference between, say, physical evil or suffering, if you, on the one hand, as opposed to moral evil. Is that the distinction you're getting at?
Yeah, I was talking about moral evil, because moral evil and suffering are two different things, right?
I think they're related, though.
I don't. I think they can be related, but I don't think they're always necessarily related.
Yeah.
For example, evil people can cause suffering, but suffering can also be caused from accidents, right? Or birth, or things that we wouldn't apply the adjective evil to. It's not evil when a child is born with a birth defect, although they may suffer from it, right?
Right, but it would be evil for a God capable of stopping that to let it happen.
True. So I guess that's what I'm asking. It sounds like God is perfectly moral, but not perfectly capable.
Right.
In your conception, Dan.
Yeah, I wouldn't say perfectly capable, but I don't mind the idea of maximal power, right, or maximal logically possible power. It's the word omnipotence that I find really problematic for all kinds of reasons. It makes the problem of evil just unsolvable. It's inconsistent with omnibenevolence, as you noted earlier, and also I think it gets in the way of the realization that all the other things that exist in the world have powers of their own. So,
now, what would be the problem with positing a God that was all powerful, but not omnibenevolent? I mean, I know that's not the God that you believe in, and it's I'm kind of going back to Caleb's question here. I'm asking it in a different way. But why couldn't we use the ontological argument that you use to support a God that was all powerful but not omnibenevolent?
Well, it seems, there have been people who have done something like that. Like the psychologist Carl Jung does something like that. You know, that there's.
I mean, Calvinists do it all the time. It's called Calvinism.
Sort of a dark presence in charge of the world, right? And it's like an evil genius in charge, right? Or an indifferent being with maximal power in charge of the universe. So there have been people who have tried to float that hypothesis. It strikes me that if you get interested in this intellectual effort to try to think through the logic of perfection, what would, the greatest conceivable being, what properties would it have? It just strikes me as wrong-headed from the start to think of a being that's not morally admirable.
Why? I mean, I know it almost sounds like a preference, like because we want it to be true, right? But just because we prefer to think of, like I when I was a theist, one of the reasons that kept me in theism is because I preferred to think that there was a God who was like watching over me. I preferred this idea of a life after death and all of the things that you get with theism that seem preferable. But I would also prefer to be a billionaire right now. But I know that I'm not, right? There's no evidence to support the fact
that's not helping your bank account.
So I can't believe that I'm a billionaire because even though I want it to be true. So we want God to be benevolent, omnibenevolent, but is that enough of a justification for assigning that property to something?
It just seems the logic of moral terms is such that we think that some people are better than others, right? And just in your own personal experience, you come across people that you just think are better people than others.
Yes.
And the logic of perfection is asking us to think about what the best being would be.
But that's moral perfection. Right. I know people who are morally better than others who were physically inferior. The morally better people have been killed by the physically superior, right? So the physically superior does exist. That doesn't necessarily mean they're morally superior. So why would the morally perfect God, why must he be why would a physically superior God to humans, why must he necessarily be morally superior?
Yeah, in a way that
This
view,
isn't a gotcha. It's just
yeah,
it's
yeah, that
head
view is,
scratcher for me. So I'm trying to
in a way,
figure it
that
out.
view is closer to classical theism than I'd like to get, because classical theists tend to claim ignorance of God's goodness, but they're really sure about God's almighty power. Um, I mean, classical theists seem to be really reluctant to give up on the notion of an omnipotent God. I'd rather give up on the notion of an omnipotent God rather than give up on the notion of an omnibenevolent God, because I find benevolence especially admirable. Whereas
Mhm.
coercive power does not impress me all that much as being admirable. Now, you're granted some people have more physical, coercive power than others, but it doesn't strike me as an admirable trait. Like the people from 20th century history that I most admire are Gandhi and MLK and people who more closely approximate omnibenevolence than others, but they were not more physically coercive than others. So Stalin and Hitler, I don't find particularly admirable just because they had a lot of coercive power. Putin has a lot of coercive power. I don't find him admirable at all. Um,
Well, that's
um,
good to know. Do you think that the ontological argument for the existence of God is the strongest argument, or do you think that it's? Well, I'll ask that question first. Do you think it's the strongest of the arguments for the existence of God?
in a way, I do, although I tend to agree with a philosopher named Peirce, Charles Sanders Peirce, that rather than thinking of arguments, only being as strong as their weakest link, I tend to think of like strands in a cable, right? So each argument type says something that can help us better understand the logic of perfection. Um, so I don't think the ontological argument all by itself does all of the intellectual or other sort of work you would want to do, right? To argue for the rationality of theism, but it's an important argument type, I think.
Well, it just seems like this perfection thing again is like that tape that you slap on afterwards to say, and it works because it's perfect. Like, let me give you an example. I'm imagining a maximally destructive God. Okay, and in order to be maximally destructive, he would have to destroy all possible things. Well, let's pretend, for the sake of argument, that we have proven the multiverse. It's at least possible. It's a possibility. It's a probability. Maybe such a universe suggests that this is actually a possibility. So I mean, I could see this as a conceivable thing. Like everything will eventually fade out into nothing, and the ultimate destructive force will have exerted its ultimate destructiveness, and is exerting its ultimate destructive nature at all times, in all places, everywhere. Has nothing to do with benevolence or anything, though. But it works because it's still a perfect being. It's going to perfectly achieve its goal.
Yeah, I understand the thought experiment there. It just doesn't seem that the word perfect works with respect to that sort of being. So you're asking us to imagine a being that is not morally admirable, but it does have maximal power in charge of the universe, right?
Yeah. This greatest being is still the greatest possible being.
It sounds like it's the most coercively powerful being, but not the greatest conceivable being.
The thing is, you're talking to this is kind of what I was pointing out before, that you're defining the terms differently at this point. How you're defining perfect and how you're defining perfect are different, which I think is part of the problem. I'm also, I don't necessarily believe this, but my co-host, I was talking to him about this idea that there is some tension between the idea of a perfect being and it having goals, because you would think that a perfect being didn't. I forget how exactly he phrased it, but it just seems to me that this term kind of fails to capture anything concrete, even though it tries to, and the argument is so dependent on this term that is actually quite ambiguous, if not completely arbitrary.
I don't know if this helps, but one of the disagreements I have with classical theism is that the classical theist tends to view divine perfection in static terms, right? So Aristotle views God as an unmoved mover.
Right.
God does, we change, but God does not change. God is strictly permanent. God is cause, but not effect, and so on. I'm trying to defend a dynamic conception of perfection. I'm picking up on what you said about this being not having goals and, no dynamism or no lifelike qualities in this being. So I think there can be such things as perfect changes, say in response to creaturely suffering or something like that. I don't know if that helps, but
we do have a question from the chat. It's from PSF, who is Josh the Archon, wants to know, Kant said something about existence is not a predicate. He actually said existence is not a predicate. Is this a good objection? And I'm not sure what that is. It must be related to something we said earlier. But do you agree that existence is not a predicate?
Yeah, that's there are a lot of people who think that basically the argument died in the 18th century when Kant developed that criticism. So that's very, very influential criticism. First of all, I think that existence is at least a grammatical predicate, right? So you can have sentences like, the ball exists or God exists.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So it functions as a grammatical predicate. This is where the modal, the version of the argument for modal logic is helpful, I think. So if you say that the ball is, you might say, what? Well, you're not really predicating anything of the ball, just to say that it is. But if you say that the ball is blue, you are predicating something significant about the ball. Now you know that the ball is blue rather than red. So also, if you say that God is, it seems that you're not really saying anything significant about God. You're not predicating anything of God just by saying that God is. However, the ontological argument is attempting to establish the conclusion that God is necessarily, that's what it means to be a perfect being, is to exist necessarily. So it seems that you are predicating something. You're saying something significant if you say that a being exists necessarily, as opposed to a being that exists contingently. Right?
I think it also matters the way that you're defining existence. If you are looking at existence as another attribute, or as the condition that allows for attributes.
Right.
And me personally, I'm unconvinced either way. I'm not sure what I think about it. I'm still kind of processing that. Both of those perspectives.
I need to make a quick correction. I said that last question was by Josh. It was actually by producer Wes. So my bad there, Wes. Dan, I just have another quick question for you, because we just passed the hour mark. But do you think that the God that you believe in, that you think this ontological argument makes a good case for, would you describe it as a personal God who actually wants some sort of relationship with humanity?
Yes. So I'm, and I don't think you get that from the ontological argument, right? So I'm relying on other things like personal experience.
How can you say that you don't get that? You just said that you have the most maximally benevolent being possible.
Right. Okay.
Wouldn't the most maximally benevolent being possible have to be aware of your misfortunes in order to be?
Right. Yeah. In that sense, I think you're exactly right. And that you can't get the moral predicates without a personal being who, if you're saying that somebody is morally good, right, that presupposes personality of some sort. That's right. Yeah.
Well, I think you're saying that he's aware, he just can't necessarily interfere in all the ways in which we wish, or even God might wish to be able to interfere.
Yeah. Another thing that we haven't brought up is I'm not trying to. So the criticism I often get from classical theists is that the God whose existence I'm trying to prove is what, a wimp God, right? That doesn't have coercive power to control everything and so on. But by the way, classical theists are much rougher on me than you guys are. So they get
I much prefer your version of God than the majority of the versions of God that I've heard from theists. So
yeah, and I should be clear, Dan. We're all atheists here, but we're also humanists, and this is kind of a science, education, philosophy experiment that we're doing here. So the goal really isn't to beat up on whatever theist proposes some new god to us. I don't know. We're trying to learn, and this is my first time hearing about this particular god concept as well. So that may be why you're getting the sense that the theists, are a little bit harder, because we're not really trying to be hard. We're just curious and asking questions.
Some atheists are defensive too, not you guys, but I mean, but classical theists can be really defensive. They have their concept of God, that they got at the truth regarding God in the 13th century or something like that, and are really resistant to sort of rethinking what the logic of perfection is all about. Well, one distinction that I've not made that may be helpful is a distinction between two different kinds of power. There's persuasive power and coercive power. And classical theists, with their version of omnipotence, tend to think of God. They use the male pronoun, right? He is what has all power and can destroy the whole world if God wants to, and so on. It strikes me that one personal experience that I've had is coming into contact with ideals, peace and justice and so on. And these ideals have a sort of persuasive power over me, not coercive power. Now, I link those up with this greatest conceivable being, right? But even if you are not a theist, you could have the experience of having ideals having persuasive power over your life. So the sort of power I think that is most admirable is persuasive rather than coercive power.
Sure. But I guess maybe the reason I was asking the question was, if the God is morally perfect and it's a personal God, and at least it may not be omnipotent, but it at least has some power to enact some kind of will, right? Why then does it, or maybe I should ask the question, is it capable of addressing suffering at all? Like any type of suffering that we see here on the earth, is it capable of intervening to stop the observable suffering that we see?
Through persuasive power, yeah. Through the posing of ideals, acting as a lure toward a better world, okay?
But is that the only way? Like, it can't directly interfere? Like, God can't stop the bullets or stop the bombs or, fix the medical, stop the heart attack? Can he actually?
That's right. Yeah, that's right. I mean, so let me go back to that Greek idea. I mean, it just strikes me that life is tragic. It's just, I don't see any overcoming that. I think classical theists do wish to overcome that through a theory of, the afterlife and so on, where all, bad things that have happened will be, righted in the end. And I just don't believe in that kind of world. Okay. When something really, really bad happens, from that point on, it will always be true that bad thing happened. So with anybody with memory, you cannot overcome evil entirely if you have memory of what has happened in the past. It's really, really bad.
Do you believe in a life after death?
I do not believe in personal immortality.
Okay.
I think that there's what it means to be Dan is integrally connected to embodiment, okay, and that this life will come to an end later rather than sooner, I hope, okay. So I do not believe in personal immortality. However, if you believe in a necessarily existent perfect being, then I would be immortal in the sense that I would always be remembered by that being.
Okay.
So it's not personal immortality. It's like a vicarious immortality.
Sure.
Yes.
Which is the same kind of, I believe that too, minus the God part. But so you don't believe in life after death, and you don't think that God actually physically intervenes in ways that most of us would describe miraculous. Would it be fair to describe you as a humanist?
Yes, yeah. I wouldn't call myself a secular humanist, but a humanist.
No,
yeah,
but
definitely,
it sounds like you are a theistic humanist.
Theistic humanist, right? And also a theistic naturalist. I don't refer to this God as supernatural. So it's a version of naturalism, and that's in disfavor, because now the trend now is to view naturalism as referring to a non-theistic view of the universe. So,
Caleb, you wanted to ask something?
I just you have these real strong preferences towards the moral predisposition of this being, and it seems like that is at odds with this idea that this maximally moral being in no way actually interacts with us in any meaningful physical sense. And that just seems really bizarre to me. I'm really having a hard time getting from the reality of the like you said, life is very tragic. Okay, everything that we see is tragic. Everything that we see is limited. And then at the end of the day, you think this is all because the least tragic, most unlimited thing jump-started it.
Yeah. At one point, Caleb, you said something like, this being does not interact with us. Actually, the way I would put it is it does interact with us persuasively or as a lure, but not coercively. So it's not as if this being is like the 18th century deist God who, made the world and then walked away from it and was completely indifferent toward it. So I take it that the greatest being interacts with us, but persuasively as a lure, rather than coercively.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was explained pretty good. And I can imagine, I have pets, right? I have a cat and a dog, and they both recognize me as the greatest possible being. I mean, they don't rationalize, and they don't have the cognitive abilities to think in those ways, but they recognize me as the greatest being because I'm the one that provides them food and shelter, right? But that doesn't mean that they can't get hurt, and it doesn't mean that I can always cure them when they get sick, and eventually they're going to die. So if I put it in that sort of analogy, I'm not a perfect being, but as far as they're concerned, I'm maximally great. And so I don't know, maybe would that be a good parallel or analogous to how you would describe it, Dan?
Yeah, that makes sense. I have no doubt that you're benevolent with respect to your pets, right?
Yeah. I mean,
I also assume that I think, I don't want to mean this to denigrate you, but I take it that you recognize limits to your benevolence. There's only some beings in the universe that you're benevolent toward, or at least in my case, the benevolence that I have for others is in a way mixed in with certain egoistic concerns that I have.
yes.
I operate from mixed motives, that my benevolent motives are sometimes, some interspersed with egoistic motives that I have. So presumably the greatest conceivable being who is omnibenevolent would care not about just a few beings, but all beings who can be cared for, and would not have its benevolence sort of marred by egoism the way mine is.
Well, that's a little problematic because sometimes I would say that you could be a being who cares for multiple other beings, but not equally. Because when my dog bites my cat or my cat swipes at my dog, I don't care for them equally. One of them needs to be punished and the other one needs to be cared for a little bit more, right? So if we're talking about a God who cares about everyone equally, well, then that's a problem because he's caring for the evil people who are causing the suffering equal to the suffering people who are the victims of the evil person. That wouldn't make sense. To me, that wouldn't jive with moral perfection either.
But I think it depends on how one views punishment and how one views the kind of conditions that lead people to do evil actions. Mm-hmm. If there was a way to even help those people so they wouldn't do those things, that would be a better world to live in. If that those kind of drives could be turned off. I think the picture of God that's being expressed here is one that doesn't have the capacity.
Right. Yeah. That's the difference I was pointing out. That's why I said I thought that was problematic from the God that Dan was presenting, because if he's maximally moral or cares for, and a personal God that cares for everybody equally, well then is he caring for the evil people equal to the victims?
Yes, but you're interpreting that as being morally inferior, while somebody and I'm not saying that I agree with either way. I'm probably
No, I
agnostic
wasn't
because-
saying that makes that the ability to care less for some than others makes one morally inferior. I was just saying that you can't care for both. If you care for both equally, that would make you morally inferior in my
right. So what
Gotcha,
what I would
yeah.
say is that a lot of you may be right, but
Mm-hmm.
I just want to throw out there that a lot of moral philosophers would disagree with what you just said. They would say that a higher moral ground would be to find compassion even for those who have hurt you and have caused damage. That is actually the more moral approach. Is to now I'm not saying that I don't know necessarily how I feel about it.
I disagree with it, but
yeah,
that's
I mean,
fine. I'm
yeah,
sure.
yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure. Many more famous and well-paid philosophers have taken that position. I disagree with them,
I probably
and that's
disagree
fine.
with it too.
That's why
I think
we're
we'd have to
here.
qualify. I don't know if I used the word equally, but if I did, I'd have to qualify it. So, presumably, an omnibenevolent being would care for your dog because your dog is a sentient being, right? But I would assume that an omnibenevolent being would have a different sort of care for you because you are both sentient and rational. So, an omnibenevolent being might not care for both equally, but would care for both. I don't know what word to use, appropriately or ideally.
How about something like he loves everything to the maximal extent that that thing could possibly be loved by anything?
Very nice. Very nice. Yeah. Very nice. Yeah. Yeah.
This has been a interesting conversation. I learned a lot. I'm glad that you came on, Dan, to kind of present for us, one, to unpack the classical ontological argument, but also to express the ways in which you use it differently, and to express the differences that you have with the people who have proposed that argument. You're proposing it for a different God. And I think that you did a pretty good job explaining that. So, sorry, we have to push back a little bit, just
That's fine.
in the
That's
interest
great.
of curiosity and
I enjoyed it.
intellectual honesty. But I think you did a good job. I appreciate you coming on. And Cease, I appreciate the fact that you were on to kind of add. Caleb and I are laymen. And you sort of do this for a living, and what you do over at Axioms on Trial, the fact that you have a brother who's a physicist, so I wouldn't have thought to ask a lot of these questions. So
Well, thank
I
you so much
appreciate
again for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Caleb, did you want to add anything else?
Yeah, I honestly,
thoughts?
I think that I just want to clarify before everybody takes off that I honestly think that perhaps one of the greatest reasons for any confusion we might have had with my last sentiment was just that I'm ultimately just opposed to this idea that even if a maximally great being is responsible for everything, that omnibenevolence is an attribute of maximal greatness. I think that such a thing is superfluous. I just don't think it's necessary.
Yeah, and I think you'll find theists come from different perspectives on this, right? Some of them will insist that God must be maximally powerful. Others will disagree. Some will say that he must be omnibenevolent. Others would disagree, right? So it's really just everybody's conception of God. Go ahead, Cease.
I think that's what's interesting about these kind of conversations is that we notice that even when, you and I, Kay, are both atheists, right? But I think our attitudes towards probably, like what you said, what would constitute a greatest being seem to be different. Because I would actually, even though I'm an atheist, I'm a more realist. And I think that certain moral behaviors are better, objectively so, than other ones. And so if there was such a thing as a God, it would be a better God if that God was moral.
It would be better if that God was moral. That's the correct answer. But if that God wasn't moral, then it wouldn't be better. It would be arbitrary.
Yeah, right. And I think going back to what I said in the beginning as to why I think the ontological argument ultimately fails is that I think its terminology is ultimately arbitrary and actually lacks content. I don't think it is able to build a bridge between the imaginary and the actual in any way that is meaningful.
It sounded like I think it sounded like Dan said that it was an argument that is convincing for him, but it doesn't stand on its own. And I suspect that you're probably using this as to make a cumulative case for God. on top of all the other arguments. So there's going to be differences of opinion about how the strength of the argument, but I appreciate you bringing it to our attention. We will no doubt tackle this again in the future. We've done the cosmological argument a couple times. We've done, what was the last argument? We've done, I can't remember, but this is the reason this is a classical argument is because you don't solve it in one conversation, right? So I would like to thank the guests for appearing. Dan, thank you so much for your first appearance on Secular Soapbox, and I hope that you can come back. Cease, of course, you are always invited at PSF. And yeah, you can find Caleb and I here Wednesdays, 7:30 Eastern Standard Time. I'd like to thank the patrons, Sunny, Phil, Jena, Linear, and everybody who participated in the chat as well. So you can find links to our Patreon and Facebook pages in the descriptions. And don't forget to like the video and subscribe to PSF. For Caleb, Sunny, Shell, Wes, Kat, Trent, Phil, Jena, Josh, and everybody else who does hard work making this show every week and all the other shows at PSF, I am Bryce Aroni for Team Promethean. We will see you guys in the future.